All right, what's up, y'all? Let's talk about customer discovery today. And I want to start out by getting into what the problem statement is, because so often entrepreneurs, they don't fail always just because of capital. That usually comes later. Before you even get to capital, before you even get to really launching your business, you really need to understand, what is the actual problem that you're solving. And some people rush to jump to a solution, and they use small sample size. The three people they interact with on Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok, or whatever social channels they are, or the two or three people that they talk to maybe in real life, but they don't really get a good large sample size of what's the actual problem and sort of taking it from there. So let's go into it. Let's dive in. So what's your problem statement, right? That's the really the genesis of business, right? What is a problem statement? So a problem statement is really just a clear sentence that explains really just a few things, right? So it explains, one, who has the problem; two, what the problem is; three, when and where does the problem show up; and then four, why it matters. Who cares, right? And so let's sort of dive in, considering those four sort of key sort of pillars of the problem statement, right? So look at the template here. So we believe that, or when, whatever occurs, right? The context of what occurs, the customer segment has whatever problem, which makes them feel, add in whatever emotion, causes whatever impact that you can quantify, right? Not just a lot, not just, some sort of broad statement, right? So look at the example here. So we believe that freelance graphic designers are frustrated with the time and administrative work involved in creating and managing project documents, causing them to lose productive time and potentially look unprofessional, right? So it's going through those things. Who has the problem? What the problem is? When and where it shows up? And why it matters, right? So look at that. Who has the problem? Freelance graphic designers, right? What is the problem? They're frustrated with the time and administrative work involved in creating and managing project documents, right? Where does it show up? Cause them to lose productive time, right? Why does it matter? Potentially look unprofessional. Okay. All right. So let's go sort of, next. So if you sort of recap this, right, the problem statement is it defines the genuine unmet need of the customer, right? That's the actual problem. Later, we'll get into the pain points and some other things. It provides really the genesis baseline for what we're going to talk about today in customer discovery, and it focuses on needs and experiences, not the solution or the product. That's a key piece that we'll get into today when you talk about customer discovery, because many entrepreneurs and many of them that come to see us at, say, River City Capital, they're so focused on the solution of the product, right? Because they want to get into the business and generating income, but you haven't really built the framework out, right? You don't really understand what their needs and experiences are. And this is something that, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to be doing over time in your business. River City Capital has been around now 15 years. We constantly have to be thinking about what are customers' needs today, not in 2010 or 2011 when we started, 2026 now and going forward. And then based on your observation data, based on what your research and your conversations, that's where you uncover the pain points. And so let's talk about that in the room. Your thoughts on the problem statement. Maybe a couple of you will be brave enough to put together a problem statement, and then we will come back for the sort of next part of our discussion. So let's do it. All right, so now let's dig into customer discovery. So, what is customer discovery? Some of you, if you're on Fanbase, you've heard me talk about it a good bit. You certainly have heard me or read me write about it on LinkedIn and Substack and some other areas. And then, if you're listening to this and you're here in Memphis or around where I have spoken on customer discovery, you've heard this before. But customer discovery is essentially the process of talking to real potential customers to understand their problems, understand their priorities, their behavior, and their decision making before you build too much of any sort of product or service, spend too much, or launch too fast. Okay. So that's my definition of customer discovery. All right. So when you think about sort of the plain language piece of that, right? What you're doing is you're learning what problem people actually have. You're learning what it whether it matters enough for them to act. And that's a key thing too. Like a lot of people whine and gripe and bellyache about problems, right? But is it a big enough problem? We'll talk later about sort of shark bite to mosquito bite, right? What size of problem? That's what you're trying to discover is how much of a problem is it that they'll actually take action, right? Learning how they solve it today is another big thing, right? So whatever it is, people are doing something today. Either they're avoiding it, they're going some sort of alternative, and typically that alternative is not as efficient, maybe more costly, maybe more time consuming, maybe more painful. Maybe it doesn't actually solve the problem, right? And so learning how they solve the problem, what they're doing today, is key to really understanding what your future customer looks like, and then learning what they value enough to pay for, right? So again, that goes back to what I was talking about before about does it matter enough for them to act? Well, then also, does it provide enough value? Like, does the problem have enough value to solve that they're willing to pay to either have it eliminated or mitigated, right? And so a lot of times we start with assumptions, right? We say, hey, I think people need this, whatever the this is, right? And then your customer discovery, what you end up finding out is I have spoken to real people, heard patterns, because that's what you're really looking for, right? You're looking for as much problem, but you're looking for a pattern. And I understand the problem better, right? By knowing the pattern, I understand the problem better, right? So what you're looking at here is sort of the process flow of customer discovery, right? So it starts with this. We'll talk hypothesis here in a second. But you want to turn your hypothesis, what you're thinking, what you're maybe seeing on social media or Reddit or whatever it is, other timelines. Your first thing is your customer discovery is you're turning your hypothesis, right, into facts, right? And facts are coming from the horse's mouth, the actual people who will actually be customers or repeatable customers for you and your business. Right. Well, and then once you go past customer discovery, now you're going into customer validation, right? So this is where you're looking at your model. You're looking at how scalable is your model? How repeatable is it, right? If it's something that you're selling in a sort of a one-time thing, right? You're not necessarily going to have a model. If it's a model that you can't build a system around, right? So it's always going to be dependent on you. You got to make the calls, you got to follow up, you got to close the sale, you got to process the paperwork. That's self-employment, right? That's either employment, you're working for a company, or that's self-employment, you've created your own job. No issues with that. But what we're talking about today is business, right? So customer validation. Then you get to the execution piece, right? This is where you begin, and this is where people usually start. But this is also where they miss, right? Is they jump right to customer creation and building the company, but without doing the front end work, you can build too quick, spend too much money, or go in the wrong direction, right? So that's where you create customers, and then you build the company. Now, back to customer validation, real quick. Sometimes you may have to pivot once you start building your model. And I've had to do this before. You start building your model after you do some customer discovery. So you've talked to 50, 100, 150 people, but then when you start building the model, you start to learn new things, right? You learn the cost of building it, the time, what it's going to involve, and maybe new issues arise in how you service what you learned in customer discovery. So then what happens is then you got to go back, right, to customer discovery and either go back to those people and ask additional questions, or you have to, um, just talk to all new people in some cases, right? And so that's a big thing that comes about, right? So questions you want to answer, right? Is the identified problem real? How frequent or intense? We'll get into that. Do you understand the person experiencing the problem? Do you understand their not just their demographics, but you understand what motivates them? Can the problem be solved? Right? Why hadn't anybody solved it? Right? It's not like you're the first person to think about solving whatever issue. Trust me. Why isn't it being solved? there's often good reasons for that, right? What will they pay? That comes a little later. And is it worth solving? That's another piece, right? And so as you get into doing your customer discovery, there's really two types of approaches, right? You can have a problem focus or a solution focused interview, right? For today, as we talk about this, I want to really focus in on the problem focused approach. All right. Now, first, you're going to need a hypothesis, right? Remember, I talked about that earlier. So, what is a hypothesis, right? It's really an if then statement, right? That's really what it is. It's an if then statement that's specific, that's going to test your problem statement, right? So, you walk into it with an assumption, okay? You make assumptions about customers, the problem, or even the value of your solution, right? And your hypothesis is what's guiding your interview questions, right? So when you're actually talking with a customer or potential customer, you're starting with your hypothesis. You want to validate it, right? So really what you want to do, and you see this here, you want to understand the customer, validate the problem, and then confirm, right, with real your primary data, right? Not secondary, not Google, not ChatGPT, not TikTok. You want to confirm with primary data before you build a product or solution, right? So let's talk real quick, and then I want to get back to a discussion. Let's talk about how you form your hypothesis, right? So your problem, right? We believe that filling your target segment is experiencing whatever your specific pain point is, right? Which causes whatever specific quantifiable outcome, right? So that's your problem. Your customer segment, right? We believe that this customer segment, who is whatever their characteristics are, who are currently doing or using whatever the alternative is to address fill in the blank problem, right? And then the other part of your hypothesis is the value. We believe that if we do this, then this will happen because this is the why, right? All right. So let's get into a couple quick examples, right? And then we'll talk about the examples in the room. All right. So examples of the problem. Let's use this. So we believe that designers are frustrated with the time and work involved in creating and managing projects, causing them to be less productive, right? So you're talking about designers who are frustrated with time and work. So this is a hypothesis, right? You haven't validated this yet, right? That's what the customer discovery is for, all right? But that's the problem, right? Many entrepreneurs start here, but then, like I said, they jump and start building a product or a service. All right, your customer segment. We believe that freelance graphic designers between 25 and 35. So now you're getting more specific, right? You're narrowing down what's your niche. Freelance graphic designers between 25 and 35 who are active on social media struggle to manage project proposals, contracts, and invoices because it's a manual process, right? So now you're digging in a little deeper with more specifics. Value. We believe if we provide an all-in-one platform, then remember the if then. If we provide an all-in-one platform, then freelance graphic designers will save a significant time on each client project because they will create and send project documents in under 10 minutes. Right? So specific time, right? So remember, it started out less productive. Now you're getting into a deeper value, right? So let's talk a little bit about problem statement versus hypothesis, right? So I talked about the problem statement defines a specific sort of pain point, right, against a hypothesis, which is really your guess about or your assumption about the problem, right? Your problem statement is a little bit more open ended, of really more defining who your customer is, what they're trying to do, what their problems are, that sort of thing. Your hypothesis is your if then, right? That we remember starts with that we believe, right? And then it outlines sort of that cause and effect piece, right? And you can see some examples there as well. All right. So let's stop here. Let's talk a little bit about it back here in the room, and then we'll come and then we'll sort of wrap this video up. All right. So let's talk all about it now. So let's get into sort of the hypothesis, let's get into some of the questions, right? Because you may be thinking, okay, so what am I asking people, right? How do I find people to ask? How do I find potential customers, right? So I'm gonna dig into that, and I'm gonna dig into what some of the questions really sound like, right? So let's talk about that, right? So let's get into some of the interview questions, right? So if you're doing a problem sort of focused customer discovery or problem statement, right? You're taking your problem statement, you're doing customer discovery. So there's a few things demographically, right, as you can see there that you want to dive into, right? What is your role? What are your responsibilities? Because you want to know to what level of decision maker you're talking with, right? Are you talking with someone that's actually going to write a check or swipe a card? Or are you talking with someone who is maybe not that level that has to go to someone else, right? So whether you're, personally someone who has to go to someone else who sort of holds the purse strings, right? So you always hear men sometimes do that. They use their wives, right? Or wives use their husbands, right? As sort of that screen. Hey, I got to talk to my wife. I got to talk to my husband, or whatever the case is, right? People in business, oftentimes they have to talk to the procurement manager or the supervisor or the someone in the C-suite, someone in management, whatever that is, or the even the top executive themselves, right? So what are the responsibilities? How long have you been at that company, right? What department or unit are you in? How many people you report to whom you report to? Can you walk me through a day in your work, right? So those are sort of the demographic pieces, right? Then you get into the sort of the drivers of business, right? You can see what are your objectives this year? How will you be evaluated? Um, After the holiday, when you look back, how will you know if you've been successful? What are your clients typically trying to achieve with their products? Those are all some of the business driver sort of questions, right? Then you start getting into some of the meat, right? And some of these you all are gonna have to flex. This is not all encompassing, right? Because different industries require different things, different products or services, right? Depending on what level and what you're talking about. So these are just some samples, right? And then you can create your own. And there's people like myself who can help you put this together. All right, problem drill down. So a big one. How are you currently solving this problem, right? So go back to your hypothesis, right? So you're sharing your hypothesis with Ron, right? All right, Ron, how are you currently solving this problem? And you want to listen. So you're asking the question and then you're documenting. You need to be doing a lot of listening. If you're doing all the talking, right, you're not going to learn a whole lot, right? So this is not about you trying to validate yourself or your ego or what you think. You have a hypothesis and now you're asking questions to validate it. All right. How do you typically work around this problem? Right. Do you expect this problem to improve, worsen, or stay the same over the next year? Why? And why is it a significant problem for you? Right. So that's starting to drill and is leading to this next section, which is the pain. Right. What would be the impact of solving this problem? Right. So, Ron, if you solve the problem of being able to design a graphic in less than 5 minutes, right? What's the impact of solving that problem? What will that do for you? Right? Very important. How many people are affected by the problem? Is it just them? Is it 1,000 other people? Right? What does that look like? Um, what percentage of the day? How much? So this is getting into time, which gets into the pain. Time's the biggest asset. What percentage of the day or week do you spend fixing the problem? Right? So this is getting into priority and getting into the pain of if you're having to spend a lot of time fixing the problem, that can create a great inefficiency that can be costly. Right? How much are you willing to pay to solve this problem? Right. So now that's getting into going back to the previous questions of, how much time are you spending fixing the problem? Well, what are you willing to pay to get that time back? Right. So that's another thing. Then ownership, right? Who else at the company has these problems? Now you're getting into multiple stakeholders. Who else in your company, in your household, right? Who else has these problems and who else benefits from the problem being solved? Another big thing, right? So that gets people to think broader, even beyond themselves, as to who else benefits, right? If I'm able to create a graphic faster, then that may mean the editor he or she can do their process faster, or maybe with less time spending trying to fix whatever problems come from my graphic, right? In this example. All right. Decision making power, a big one. You got to make sure that your potential customer again is someone that can, make calls, right? If you spend a lot of time talking to people who ultimately can't make the decision choice, you're going to spend a lot of time, just spinning your wheels, right? So, what was the last solution you invested in? Who also is involved in making the decisions? And do you need to collaborate with them before making a decision, or again, are you able to make the call if you want to move forward? Your processes, right? How are you currently handling the problem? Who gets involved and when? What tools, procedures, and solutions are you currently using? And then how do you decide to use them, right? All part of understanding someone's process, right? And then a big one is that's getting you closer to, taking your pain and then quantifying it even more is ROI or return on investment, right? So you want to learn that from people. How much time are you estimate solving the problem currently? How much money do you spend solving the problem? How many hours do you spend solving the problem? And then quantify if you can. Sometimes people can't always do this, but quantify the loss in dollars, time, frustration, right? So those are just some, sort of key questions, ladies and gentlemen. Again, not all encompassing. A lot of that was also a little bit more B2B catering, business to business catering. If you're more B2C or if you're B to B2C, right? So you're business to business to consumer, your questions may look a little different, right? All right. So where do you find these people? Right. So people always, complain and they say, well, Ron, I'm not in a big city. I don't get out much. So I don't, know a ton of people, right? I spend most of my time on my phone. All right. So finding interviewees, right? So one, everyone has some existing network, right? So begin working that. Where do people who go back to your hypothesis, right? So with your hypothesis, where do those people spend their time, right? Are they at office buildings? Are they out shopping during the day? Are they working during the day and then doing something on the weekend? Are they largely business owners? And so, depending on if they're in retail or again B2B, where they spend their time. What do they read is a big thing too. Like, what do they engage? Are they strictly social media people? Are they social audio folks? Are they, sort of real life in real life and actually out and about in the world doing things? Some combination. What does that look like? And then what are their behaviors and tendencies? Right. LinkedIn is a big piece. I know it was always funny. People sometimes avoided LinkedIn. They're worried about their boss being on there and seeing what they're doing because LinkedIn, people can actually go through and you can see who's been looking at your profile. So that's different than the other social medias. And people tend to be they're all close to their authentic selves as possible, right? So it's not the level of anonymity that people love when they're online. So, but LinkedIn is a great platform if you invest in it that you can connect with people. And I'll show you sort of actually a sample script that you can use when reaching out. Um, you want to build your list of about 100 people, right? So you need a good sample size. I know a lot of times, again, especially in social audio, we make broad statements with the four people that we either know or people that we think we know because we follow each other, but then and you see whatever they post on the timeline. So now all of a sudden you know people. Um, but you need to build that list of 100 sort of true, real human beings, right? Not bots. And then go to meetups and trade shows, right? Even those that are virtual, but you got to get active, right? You need to meet people. And then I'm gonna go through here real quick, sort of a sample of how you can connect with them, right? Um, so we'll get into some questions there. So when you're doing outreach, right, you want to introduce yourself, leverage your connection to any program you may be working with, anything that you're affiliated with. Here's a big thing. Don't introduce yourself as the CEO. I know a lot of times we're quick to, again, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. We run and we create these businesses and, we slap titles on things and we feel good about it. And, we can tell mama and, everybody that we're the CEO. But in this case, if don't introduce yourself as a CEO, because if you do that, people are going to sort of tailor their responses to what they think you want to hear, right? Remember, you want to get as authentic of a response as possible. And sometimes when you come in with how people stack rank titles, you may not get an authentic response. As for 15 minutes, in person is best, right? You can still do video chat, but definitely look to in person. Reference their expertise or something you know about them, right, to help build that connection, right? You can use some flattery, but again, another key thing is you're not selling here, right? Remember, you're not getting into solution. I haven't said anything about solution, product, features. It does this, this, and this, and blah blah blah. This is not selling, right? This is discovery, right? This is understanding. Okay. So here's sort of a template, and this is, from the iCourse program at the University of Memphis, and I went through this, and my dad went through this, so it's really dope. We actually went through it at the same time, he and I. But here's sort of a basic template, right? That you may want to send out, just basically suggesting that, hey, I'm participating in this program, or I'm involved in this, or hey, I'm a part of this group or some group that you've put together. Hey, I'm part of the In the Black research team. And I want to learn the challenges and pain points of people working in, and this is going to be your fill in the blank, depending on what you're doing, right? But in this case, hey, the field of nutrition, diseases, acute care, and rehabilitation. Given your expertise in this area, and this is where LinkedIn helps, right? Or if you can have some idea of what people do, would you be willing to give, say 15 minutes of your time to talk about your experiences? Maybe it's over Zoom, maybe it's over coffee, whatever that is. And then at that point, give, say three, sort of time options, right? And then in the email or the DM, whatever that is, message at that point, right? All right. So we're going to come back and we're going to quantify the problem, but let's talk about what we just went through as far as sort of the problem statement, the questions for customer discovery, and how you connect with actual potential customers to do the actual discovery. All right. So now let's quantify the problem because again, it's not enough to just say a lot, right? We're not 21 Savage or J. Cole, right? So we're not talking about just a lot. You need to have some numbers, right? All right. So let's think through some of the metrics, right? So you want specific sort of measurable goals, right? Those are going to help you really determine how significant is the problem, right? And once you get to the solution, right, your product or service, it's going to basically help guide you into how your solution is going to aggressively address whatever said problem is, but you need to size it up, right? Um, your metrics are only a hypothesis until you actually gather the data, right? So remember, your hypothesis doesn't really become anything until you do the customer discovery and you can quantify things. So remember some of the questions we talked about before, right? And you can see in this example, you always want to get into time, right? Because things, human beings are limited on time, right? If anything. So you want to track how many hours, how many days, how many weeks, how many months, that sort of thing. Anything that's manual, right? So anything that takes grunt work to accomplish, or that's loaded in what I call key person risk, right? Where all the information and everything to accomplish a task is centered in, just like one person, right? And then who are the stakeholders, right? Who are the other people that this matters to, the problem matters to, or having the problem solved matters to, and what's their level of satisfaction, right? Um, so remember, your metrics are only a hypothesis until you get the data, right? So in your customer discovery, those questions that we asked earlier, those are open-ended questions that give you either a qualitative or quantitative response, right? So things like tell me about the last time you created a project report, how long did it take? Those are more, those are open-ended questions, right? That are either getting into qualitative or quantitative pieces, right? Tell me about is typically going to give you a qualitative response. How long something or how much time, or once you get a little more specific, that's going to give you more of a quantitative response, right? Surveys, you can send out surveys, but again, for the purposes of this, I would recommend that you all not do that people get enough Survey Monkeys and enough Google Forms and all that, you're not always going to get the best responses or true responses. It's certainly not like being face to face, right? So you can talk to people on the phone, you can meet them in person, or you can even have a virtual setup like this, right? And then you got secondary research, right? So that can come from other analysis that's been done, that can come from other sites, things like that, that can give you some additional research to support what you're learning, right? All right. So now, how intense is the pain? Yeah, I mentioned this earlier, right? So you really, at the end of the day, you have to understand this because this is going to determine do you have a business or not, right? Is it a shark bite, right? So is the trend, remember the patterns that you're hearing from people. So you talk to 100 people, right? Or is it a shark bite? Meaning this is something that's taking a ton of time. It's a lot of pain. It's very manual, right? And there's a lot of impacts that they're dealing with, right? And some people just learn to deal with it. Others not so much, right? They find other alternatives that are just as painful, if not more painful. Or is this a mosquito bite, which mosquito bites are annoying, right? But it's not like getting being bit by a shark, right? So a mosquito bite, you put something on there, whatever. A few hours later, it sort of goes away, stops bothering you. So if it's just a mosquito bite, it doesn't mean that you don't have a business, right? So let me repeat and be clear. Doesn't mean that you don't have a business and it's, oh, well, a mosquito bite just may be what level of product or service, what level of solution you're providing. And also, it's going to tell you how motivated someone is. Someone who gets bit by a shark is going to be very motivated to have that remedy, right? People who get a mosquito bite are typically not running around trying to get people to solve that for them, right? They typically take care of that themselves. So that's what you want to know. You're trying to get how intense the pain. That's going to give you how motivated they are, how much of a repeat customer. And once they can understand the value of your solution, are they going to be repeat buyers, right? Because the idea of creating a business is to have, when you talk about systems, is also to have repeat buyers, right? At River City Capital, we want to be able to have repeat folks, people who need sort of stages of capital at the right time, right? It's something that I've built with our River City Capital sort of ladder approach, right? Where how are we providing people the right type of structured capital? Whether it's what I call a proof of concept grant, to a sort of growth, access to capital to sustainable, right? The sustainable line of credit. So it's thinking about that process flow, and at each lane, there's a level of pain. And of course, what we determine is it's a colossal shark bite, right? Because accessing the right capital and the right terms at the right time was something that we identified and part of from our hypothesis to our problem statement, right? All the way to customer discovery, right? So how intense is the pain? How frequent, right? What are some more sort of metrics that you're solving, right? So that's something to think about is what are some of the quantifiable metrics related to the pain point that you're solving, right? So you got to think about that. What are the things that you want to know in terms of numbers from people, right? How much, when, how much time, all those type of things. Um, how much does it cost? So there's some additional metrics depending on your industry that you may want to know as well. So hopefully this was informative for you. Let's continue to have the conversation going forward here, whether you're in the room, whether you're watching this online, reach out to me and let's continue to talk about it. But customer discovery is extremely important, ladies and gentlemen, and it can be the key to how you invest in your business and how sustainable your business is as you go through your different life cycles. So appreciate y'all checking this out. Peace to you.